hear me? Am I audible?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. Wait, let me set my timer. No preferred pronouns. If you want a POI, just unmute the mic, but please don't badger. All right. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition supports the development, continuation of drag culture, drag shows, whatever its forms. And we understand that drag culture is not just about drag race or TV shows, right? It also involves activities of drag queens performing in restaurants, cafes, festivals, and etc. Second of all, however, we don't think that queer movement should encourage the participation of cis male in our culture. We think that the culture, the drag culture, is a safe space for non-heteronormativity, gay men, gender non-conforming individuals that should not be interfered by the existence of the very person that demeans the value of our protection. Thirdly, opening opposition thinks that agree that toxic masculinity is bad, we should oppose that. But solving that should not get through inside the platform. Opening government has yet to prove how the education or the internalization of men through this platform will be meaningful for men to understand the gender fluidity or to understand the flexibility of gender, because we can educate, socialize through any other means, but not attract them through this platform. We just think this is an unnecessary act, especially inside this context of drag culture. The education or socialization about gender fluidity is formed in a performance way. No, thank you. In a performance way. We don't think that men could conceptualize or comprehend how gender fluidity necessarily means if the spotlight in that regards is framed in that way. So therefore, we don't think that their policy will be effective. What I will talk about in my speech, I'm going to talk about 2 things. First, I will talk about why drag culture provides safe space for queer individuals and why that protection will be disrupted with the existence of cis male. Number 2, I'm going to talk about who will benefit the most from this policy and why is it harmful. But before that, a couple of extraneous response from against opening government. They talk about boundaries, boxing, and awareness, right? How we just create that box to limit people, and now they remove all of those barriers. We view that the policy is good at its surface, but this is contingent upon the reaction of men after participating. None of the analysis coming from Prime Minister indicates any process or likelihood analysis why it's going to be good or create a meaningful outcome. Second of all, they say the queer movement has a responsibility to represent what's actually happening in real life. And in real life, you have to know that there are cis male as well that you have to interact with. But exactly, real life is already hard, and this is their only place to get protection and empowerment. Why would you bother to also interfere them in addition to the already existing harsh real life with their own very place they should have had protection in the first place? So we don't think that their policy will be good. First argument, why drag culture provides safe space for queer individuals and why their policy disrupts this. The purpose of drag culture is to empower individuals, especially the queer community, to self-express and self-actualize. It reclaims the female gender traits, which was assumed to be associated to women and demean women's agency as a form of empowerment, especially in a context where drag culture is highly dominated by minority communities. There are most of drag queens are coming from POCs or Latinos and etc. What is the problem with the existence of cis male? There are some problems I'd like to highlight here. Number 1, in principle, the existence or the involvement of cis male empowers the narrative of heteronormativity. The main purpose of this culture is to against conforming of heteronormativity. By the inclusion of cis male in this, it empowers the narrative of heteronormativity, that it is cis male now taking the agency over not only women, but also the most vulnerable community, in addition to them being queer, but also POC, the Latinos, and the very vulnerable minority groups that we have in status quo. So we don't think that their policy is in principle good. Number 2, what Prime Minister lacked on was to clarify the process of attracting men inside, as pointed out by closing opposition. When you attract men, there are certain trade-offs that you would have to make in that particular drag culture. When you force or attract men to participate, you are forced to include men's interests and need to be able to attract them, which comes at the expense of your own culture. Because you want to attract them to participate, you need to modify certain type of your culture. Probably you can't be too sassy, or probably the appearance must not be too extravagant, or probably you should not criticize or mock men. There are many other forms, obviously, that will come at the expense of their policy, but the precursor of achieving men's viewers is obviously to include men's interest in there, which comes at the expense of the modifications of our own culture, which we don't think is actually something that is good. No, CG. Thirdly, we think that their policy is also a form of commodification of cultures or identity. The discussion that was existing inside the drag culture, from the celebration of self-expression, from the struggle of queer communities, from the celebration of self-identities, becoming to talk about cis male-centric narrative, it shifts away the spotlight of queer communities empowerment into talking about these individuals because of the fact that there's a certain level of privileges of attraction that cis male have in that particular discussion, especially when they want to make men as the guest star in this particular shows. We don't think that it will be good at all on that set of house. Before proceeding to the last reason, I'll take CG.
Being cis male does not make you entirely heteronormative as well, because even cis males can also be gay. So why that heteronormativity argument is exclusive?
Yeah, obviously, if they are like the allies of us, probably they will not be bothered by, and they will watch the shows anyway. But your policy is to make them as the center part of the shows, which you don't think is actually good for the culture in general. Lastly, even if there's some benefits that will exist in government side of the house, if anything, this creates a cis male savior narrative, because that it is because of cis male, that is because of men that this culture becomes so popular. That is because of the contributions of men's identity that this culture are getting more and more empowered. That is why we think that the main priority of this culture should be the empowerment of the queer community. Before you get external help, before you get external empowerment or communication with other, the most important priority is to these individuals. It is not certain to get any help or any aid or any assistance from outside. What is most important is the empowerment of the individuals inside. And the very people will be feeling uncomfortable when there's an inclusion of cis male on that side of the house. Second of all, you get to also question who gets to benefit from this, because we don't think it empowers the individuals working of like the drag queens, right? Or like the queer community. More often than not, this policy only benefits things like company or production houses, which can continue their shows because of the existence of male in that particular regards. They get increase of rating or reviews or profits, which allows them to incorporate this culture with things like queer baiting, trans baiting, because now it becomes very normalized on that side of the house by the inclusion of cis male in that particular regards. We think that drag culture is a safe space. Do not disrupt that by the existence of cis male. Thank you.
Check. Audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Cool. Gender. Preferred pronoun? No. No preferred pronouns. POI preference, just unmute yourself, but don't heckle. Like you have 20-30 seconds interval. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. My biggest problem with opening government's case, and apparently CG's POI, is that although they're trying to essentially, I would say that there are indeed cis males participation already, but the number is especially not very strong enough. There's not many of them. Most of the drag culture still consists of the queer community and trans community. Thus, I don't think they were truly being genuine in the process to entice more cis male towards the drag culture. When they're talking, opening government, for example, talking about this vague notion about discussion, demystification, because of lack of understanding, and therefore you get benefits of allies and activism, which, by the way, hung on the premise that the process is successful and they're a positive allies, not a toxic participant in the culture. I don't think that's truly genuine. When they're talking about marketing, for example, I don't think they necessarily truly analyze the process analysis of how people are enticed to partake in a certain culture. That said, let's talk about two things. One, let's talk about who have vested interests to include more cis male in drag culture. Secondly, let's talk about why this is incredibly dangerous and possibly exacerbate transphobic and queerphobic culture in an otherwise safe space area. Firstly, when you're talking about who have vested interests, this is incredibly dangerous due to the commodification that we're talking about. Because when they are talking about marketing, for example, ladies and gentlemen, you don't you won't be able, let's be honest, to like create nuanced discussion in a marketing or ads. There is this notion of golden 20 seconds in marketing, because that's just how long the attention span of an individual on average are. Admit it, like after 5 seconds of YouTube ads, almost all of us press skip. Now tell me, what kind of nuanced discussion can you generate out of that? That's, by the way, also the reason why in marketing of advertisement in general or movies, people and directors use racial, religious, and sexual stereotypes. The reason is because it's easily understood by the general society and mass. What does this mean? This means that you're going to have an incredibly simplified message with stereotyping, with almost purely entertainment only area, which is very susceptible towards either fetishization or towards commodification that's dangerous, towards remarks that are insensitive. For example, ladies and gentlemen, what am I talking about? The cis males problems of insensitive remarks. We're talking about transphobic, like the notion about gaping genitalia, for example, in status quo, even in drag culture. More and more of that will be seen after more cis male partake in the culture, who otherwise wouldn't be able or wouldn't partake in the drag culture anyway, because the existing cis male, even those who still make bad remarks, mostly are those who have at least queer or trans circles. This means that they should have been sensitive, but some of them even are not. Now imagine those who get included and partake in the discussion out of advertising, out of 20 seconds advertising. Would you really be able to understand the differentiation between gender identity, gender expression, and the nuanced notion about why there is an interlink between like sexualization or sexual culture and also like drag culture in general, ladies and gentlemen? I don't think you're going to necessarily enable that happen at the end of the day. So this becomes a no longer empowering safe space. Let's talk about the second part of the issue. When you're talking about inclusion of more cis male in the drag culture, why would that be the case? 3 reasons for that. Number 1, you're going to have cognitive dissonance among drag queers, among drag queens and kings, among the queer and trans community about how they should behave, how should they respond to the attempt from the community to commodify their lives, to commodify their expression, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that cognitive dissonance is incredibly dangerous within the culture. Secondly, you integrate cis male and you are integrating yourself, the drag culture, into a world where most of the times the culture itself is defined and shaped by cis males' interests and needs, the interests and needs for more pure entertainment as opposed to like the discussion and messaging opening government seemingly wanted. For example, the pure like, oh, I'm just kidding remarks, for example, the comedic nuances of drag culture and drag queen and kings in general, as opposed to creating a genuine conversation from a limited number of people. Admittedly, we'll concede that, but we're happy to defend fewer number of people towards within the culture that is protective towards its members who are the least privileged in general. Thirdly, because you're going to have superficial appreciation. What would be appreciated? You're funny. You're good at parties. That's incredibly superficial. You're creating transphobic culture and exacerbating transphobia in general and queerphobia in general as well. That's incredibly dangerous given the alternative is just superficial appreciation. Any point from closing? I encourage engagement. Nada. Fine. Let's talk about then why the superficial appreciation is going to be incredibly dangerous given the protection is not going to be there. Why would that be the case? First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I think that the superficial appreciation is going to be much worse off on their side of the house, because the ability for people to truly understand that cis males need to behave in a cautious manner will not happen. Why? Because they are perceived and they take themselves to be the center of discussion at the end. That's how co-optation that Shagun talked about happens, ladies and gentlemen, because you're now the primary market and people pander to you, the drag culture pander to you. And this is incredibly dangerous, especially, ladies and gentlemen, the superficial appreciation due to the sexualized culture within drag community as drag culture as well. When we're talking about trans culture, it's highly interlinked with sexualization, and especially to the people of color and minority. 2015 US Trans Survey reported that the numbers of sex workers from trans community is very high within the unprivileged community. Black 42%, Indigenous 28%, multiracial 27%, Latina 23%, and Asian 22%. When male, cis male, most likely white, by the way, who are very privileged and they are going to sexualize, fetishize, commodify these individuals on the basis of a very simplified messaging and very dangerous stereotypes. I think that hurts more towards this minority, towards minority within minority, and that's going to hurt this community so much. This is not important for drag culture. This will not protect the members of the drag community, and for that reason, we oppose.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Member of Government, for that fine speech. We now welcome the Member of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Right, cool. Oh wait, am I audible?
Audible.
Okay, audible. Right. My preferred gender pronoun is he, him, and my preferred POI method is through the chat. All right. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CO says that drag culture is still gonna expand. That is to say, of course, we're still gonna, ensure that more people watches it. We're gonna ensure that it's still gonna be Netflix and so on and so forth. But more importantly, I think what differentiates opposition from government that I think it needs to be understood is that we think this kind of this attempt at inclusivity towards cis male exactly is the kind of unnecessary efforts that inherently harms the community in and of itself, right? We think other forms of ensuring people understand exist, that is through education, discussion, for example, but specifically targeting cis male in terms of social media challenges that all government wants inherently is a form of inclusivity that is harmful, right? What we will exactly because budget allocation and it modifies efforts to match their interests. We think, though, second point of framing is that I think it needs to be conceded that cis male that are allies but don't want to participate in drag race, for example, that government wants, is inherently already most likely to be exposed to drag race culture anyway, right? It looks like if they're already woke, as you said they are, they're most likely going to be exposed, for example, to their LGBT friends who are talking about drag at the end of the day, right? They're already part of the leftist bubble, for example, on which drag culture, even they claim, is already so powerful at the end of the day, right? But why do we need to educate them then? If they already understand about what drag culture is, for example, at the end of the day. At best, government has no urgency in their particular, in their case at the end of the day, right? What we will do is we're gonna be the team that actually analyzes why it is inherently harmful when the discussion happens based on the social media challenges. We're gonna analyze why even if they want to join, drag culture is very intricate, very complicated, that cis male won't be able to understand at the end of the day, right? First things first, let's talk about drag culture. Let's picturize, right? Let's talk about drag culture at the end of the day. We think if what government is gonna do is from social media challenges that happens in 20 seconds or whatever.
Pause for a while because the chair got disconnected.
Oh, right. What's the time?
2:06.
2:06. Okay, I'm gonna 7 menit kurang 12.
Oh yeah, give the chair a second to join. 1 second.
5:14, Gar.
Oh, sorry. Oh shit, gak di mute. Maaf.
I'm so sorry.
Yes. Can you tell me where you last heard me? Like, what was the last sentence or something?
1 second. I'm 2 seconds. Sorry.
Sorry, you're inaudible.
Oh no, it's in there too. She's robotic. Give us a second. Yeah, we're trying to recontact the chair.
Super fun. All right, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In CO, we want drag culture to still expand, right? That is to say, we still want drag culture, for example, to still exist in Netflix, for example, to still socialize education, and so on and so forth. The difference between opposition and government, and this needs to be clear, is that we're not specifically targeting the participation of chismail into our movement, right? That is to say, we're not specifically gonna make, challenges or TikTok, like products or content specifically targeting them. We're not going to modify, for example, our content just to fulfill their interests or allocate resources to ensure that they're included, right? But second point of analysis, and that is also important, we think that if government wants to say that the people who are gonna be, swayed by this particular content are chismail who are allies of the LGBTQ movement but does not participate in drag race, most likely first it's gonna be woke people who are already exposed to drag culture ideas anyway, right? These are people who exist in left bubbles, for example, on Twitter, who are already friends with, for example, drag friends or LGBTQ people who are already exposing about what drag culture is, for example, and why it's good at the end of the day. So it means that they're already exposed to it. There's no urgency for this motion to happen. But two, we question what kind of education they're actually gonna get, right? Because we don't think that the education, we don't understand why this kind of education is a necessary education, for example, why this is specifically, this social media content that only exists in 20 seconds, for example, is a sufficient form of education to actually shift, for example, the already ingrained calculus about what masculinity and patriarchy is, for example, why this is actually enough, for example, to that kind of a shift to inherently happen, right? No explanation, therefore we don't think there's any urgency, for example, for all government bench at the end of the day. So what we'll see or talk about, right? We're going to talk about why inherently this kind of cry for participation inherently actually makes harm, for example, because the discussion is going to be bad. But two, why drag culture is very intricate, very complicated, that chismail who are not, for example, who are exposed to this kind of social media content are most likely to not want to, are not going to be able to understand. So let's talk about discussion, right? Why drag culture participation is bad for the chismail at the end of the day. We think that Gov's case, all of it is reliant and conceding on the idea that toxic masculinity exists, right? That patriarchy is still a very much powerful system, for example, existing especially in cis male because they're, for example, it's already ingrained for years and years, for example, applied in lots of institutions at the end of the day, right? The real world patriarchy is very hard for you to accept feminine ideas, right? Especially in masculine cis male that government seems to talk about at the end of the day, right? We think in social media challenges, it looks like you're posting, for example, take Instagram story, for example, about you walking in high heels in, like back and forth in a room and story, for example, shared to your masculine cis male friends so they also understand at the end of the day. The problem is that even if these are gray area males, for example, who are doing it, the friends they associate with, for example, who are most likely to also be, part of the popular patriarchal culture, are gonna shame them in that particular instances, right? That is to say, they're gonna talk about, why are you wearing dresses, for example? Why are you wearing, why are you such a girl at the end of the day? That this is something that's shameful, right? The conclusion is that even if gray area people participate in the challenge, they're gonna be shut down by the more popular narrative of patriarchal people who also exist in much abundant numbers, for example, thus pressuring him to actually not want to contribute, for example, in that particular, challenge at the end of the day. So the challenge, even if it's done well, is more likely going to be drowned out with the patriarchal culture, with patriarchy and toxic masculinity that exists. So the discussion is most likely going to be bad, right? Because the gray area people are more likely to not want to be dissuaded, for example. No explanation in Gulf, where they are more likely to not feel shame, for example, where it's going to be an equal footing between the left bubble that is minority, the LGBTQ, and why the big powerful patriarchal media that they want to fight at the end of the day. So what happens, we think, it's going to be two separate bubbles, right? One where the leftist media, leftist male, sings to the choir about people who are already accepting of LGBT notions and doesn't necessarily need this urgency. And the other, where the social media content is circulating among men, for example, who are cis and hateful, who wants to only make fun of drag culture, for example, for even attempting to do this, right? This happens because education in current status quo is inherently not sufficient enough, right? We think this kind of attempt will only necessarily hamper and, be ammunition, for example, for the hateful people on their side to inherently hate on us. But second, even if there's engagement, even if the gray area exists and people want to necessarily use this particular content, it's gonna be a polarizing, gay rights is still a polarizing issue and it's dangerous, right? What happens is what we see with all cis males who are inherently, like popular and, fighting at the end of the day, right? Before I move on, OG.
When toxic mask haters shame you, which is going to happen either way, who is better to give rebuttal? Is it the traumatized gay kids who's going to be seen as giving gay propaganda, or cis men that says, bro, it's not that bad?
The question becomes, why would the cis male be wanting to, for on your side, why they're gonna want to actually fight for that particular rights anyway, right? Because on your side, when you say that, okay, they're gonna understand what it feels like to be hated, for example, they're gonna understand what it feels like to walk in the shoes of these gay men, the conclusion isn't gonna be, I'm gonna fight for them. Most likely, they're gonna revert back, for example, to their patriarchal ideas that, oh shoot, I don't wanna feel this way again, for example. There's something that's inherently traumatizing and so on. So I don't wanna, for example, do this again. No explanation as to why they would want to have incentive, for example, to fight. But moving on, right? It's gonna be dangerous because when you want these gay kids, for example, LGBTQ people to, or these cis men, for example, to necessarily post and create engagement of the hateful people on the left, most likely it's going to escalate the harms, right? Because the cis male, the hateful ones will feel like, oh, this attempts from the gay people, for example, to brainwash us to become like them. This is playing into a patriarchal narrative that gay men are, infectious, or it's going to be something that's going to spread, for example. The problem is that they're going to fight back just as hard in terms of doxing, hate crime, something that is not strange that cis men do in front of the school, especially when talking about this, right? But lastly, right? We think dread culture is complicated in the way that, one, it is built upon references of political messages, for example, of reclaiming and appropriation. Talks about how the F word, for example, is reclaimed by LGBTQ members, for example, in drag community, exactly because it has a political weight that cis male that understands and taps into the particular discussion just from the social media is never going to understand, right? It's about the action or the technique, for example, of voguing. The idea of wearing wigs and performing is not just dancing. It's a form of self-expression that comes from years and years of hate, right? Cis male joining this particular thing only hampers because it minimizes the value of drag culture that is so powerful for LGBTQ members, right? Most likely, even if they understand, it's gonna be appropriated to be modified to ensure that, oh, it's just gonna be something that I like, for example, not the political message it is very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, member of opposition, for that fine speech. We now welcome the government whip to end the case for government side. Here.
Test, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, cool. POIs through chat, through the raise hand feature, or turn on your camera and wave and say hi. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In the birthday parties of the richer kids in like really elite high schools, they invite drag queens occasionally to perform, to dance in the middle of their cis male friends and for them. You would think that this is a form of appreciation, a form of normalization, because they see that this is a culture that we can also enjoy. But then they return back to their schools and then they use harmful slurs that are meant to like harm and like necessarily mock the gay community. They go back and then they go back to shaming their male friends who use, for example, nail polish and so on and so forth. Simply having them perform and simply inclusion does not mean that you're going to get the acceptance as you get, because as ridiculous and as disgusting as it is, people do engage with content just so they can hate on it. That's the reason why a lot of shitty rappers get any sort of law again, right? But I think that what needs to be pointed out in this debate is that the queer community needs to get their priorities straight, right? I think the nuance that I'm getting from the golf bench entirely is that they should care about the allies. They should care about their cis male allies, right? My question then is why? Because one, these are people who are directly perpetrators of your culture, right? Probably if they're only talking about strictly cis male allies who are already not that conventional and not that conservative to begin with, then it's not that significant anyway. These are people who, for example, use the F slur daily, right? But second of all, even if they're not actively participating, cis male benefit off of patriarchy, right? The fact that they can easier get jobs, the fact that they don't have to face scrutiny daily, and so on and so forth. we don't want to sacrifice queer people. We don't think that drag queens should be used as the shield towards all this homophobia and all this hatred and all this scrutiny, understanding that the queer community has problems in accessing, for example, help for their like mental health care and all the other basic needs that they get, right? Understand that in this motion that you're probably going to sacrifice this small amount of drag performance for the sake of the betterment for everyone else. It's not even a very vulnerable state, right? Why CO wins this debate is because we're able to prove to you what happens within exactly the drag community and understand the directions that these cis male are going to take historically, also like how they usually take to the feminist movement, right? Talking about how they have the tendency to drag cultures that they don't understand, and they will continue to do so out of spite. They will dox these drag queens and make sure that they do crimes to them or like make them get fired or anything. And they're also capable of spamming these queens inbox with hate comments and all kinds of things that should not be appropriately sent to the most vulnerable members inside our community, right? So I'm going to engage with the government bench one by one. I think my first question then, when they talk to you about toxic masculinity being harmful and so on and so forth, we don't really care. The priority of the queer community should be for the queer people, right? Regardless of whether they're gay or not. Understand that toxic masculinity towards like a few cis male who still enjoy the benefits being derived for the patriarchy is not that important, right? But when they talk to you, basically like the crux of their case and like majority of it also being included inside closing government case is about accessibility for people to join, to witness and experience, right? Three responses. First of all, are there accessibility problems to the point where you are unable to access drag culture willingly, right? You have RuPaul on Netflix. You even have local shows in Indo that is known for to be wildly homophobic, right? That means that access is not a problem as long as you have the incentive to do so, right? But then the question is, why will acceptance stem from being habituated to seeing it? Why will people seeing random TikToks suddenly not take for granted and be able to accept it, right? Because we think that people commonly watch it to ridicule, right? The fact that we watch Mimi Pri's content, the fact that we watch Keanu's content, and a lot of the creators, they're commonly not being seen as someone who is admirable, means that they have the tendency to watch it, but still not accept it out of like doxing and all these other things, right? But thirdly, we think that acceptance needs to come from self-awareness, right? We think that allyship needs to come from themselves, and we don't need certain trends. Because what happens when you rely on trends for the acceptance of certain minorities, it's going to be simplified in a way that is harmful, right? Let's take a look at BLM. A few months after BLM, you found a lot of creators who were previously like had BLM profile pictures eventually turn out to be racist even after the entire movement went viral, right? That means that people don't really care. A trend is just a trend. And especially because they're trying to champion the benefit of social media, we don't think that they're also going to understand the significance. But then DPM comes and talks to you about how even if people are not convinced, they're going to gradually normalize it, right? The question is, why is it going to be normalized and how is it normalized, right? Because if you see them and you don't understand the intricacies behind it, the history behind it, you're just going to see people wearing heels and you don't see that as a non-binary action. You see that as a TikTok trend. That's even more devaluing and dehumanizing, right? Because previously, for example, wearing heels used to be a sign of courage for non-cis people. Used to be identifiers for you to see your fellow gay person on the street and so on and so forth. That's what's going to be devalued exactly on their setups, right? But lastly, they try to claim of internationalized things on all these other things. Exactly, right? We think that in the current status quo, they're already appropriating queer culture and attributing it as cis, as internet language, as popular language, right? Things like go off cis and all these other things are not being attributed to where they came from and their original origins were not being respected at all, right? So I don't think OG can win in this case. But mostly regarding how most of their benefits can be accrued through promoting it to everyone in general, right? We don't have to specifically strategize and talk to cis male. But let's move on to CG's case, right? CG talked to you about the inclusion of not conservative but ally, right? My question is this: what is the delta and what is the significance of this amount, right? Because if it's true that they're allies, then they're probably people who are already engaging with our content anyway or respecting it. Right? My question is, what are they going to do? We think that the harms that we talk about that went unresponded to or unpreempted, things like hate crimes, things like being doxxed, things like sacrificing the mental health of drag queens and so on and so forth, this outweighs the benefit. And the benefit, what did they even try to champion to you? They talk to you about pronouns in bio. Pronouns in bio is a perfect example of what evolved from normalizing an attempt to like normalize queer culture to entitlement, right? Because the pronouns in bio turns like if you don't put pronouns in your bio, then that probably means you're homophobic. No, closeted individuals exist and we need to respect them, right? People with neo pronouns are still made fun of even within the LGBT community, right? People will mansplain this. We think that exactly this kind of culture and this kind of progress in like this identity can progress in the exact same way. But secondly, they talk about the appreciating of allies in gender expression, right? Why is this important? Is this male, even without the support of the queer community, have anyone else to do, right? Understand that queer community has no one else to go to but the queer community. We do not want to rely on cis male validation again and again when the reason we have been oppressed is exactly striving for cis male validation, right? When they talk to you about the vindicative, exactly. Understand that the vindication that comes from the gay community, understand about how people who love everyone are still able to shut you out means that you're that bad of a person. The reason why they don't want to accept cis male is exactly because it stems from trauma. The way you have to force victims to bite bullets and constantly like take it as an okay when their friends try to make jokes about drag race, their friends try to undermine or like misgender the drag queens that are going to perform and so on and so forth, is not a burden that we want to impose on the most vulnerable members of our community. Never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you very much, opposition, for that fine speech. That concludes the entire debate. I want to thank everyone in this debate for giving us all a good show. Please wait here while the judges deliberate, and we will come back when the announcements are ready. Thank you.